coming to get you, Barbara.
I ain't one to make a fuss about a thing like that.
Make your wishes.
They're coming for you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Deep Cuts of Horror, where we analyze and review the overlooked and underappreciated films in the annals of horror cinema and decide if they are deep, meaning we find some value in it and think maybe you should give it a watch, or if it should be cut, meaning you should probably find something else to watch with your time. My name is Dylan, and today I'm joined again by my co-host Jacob. Say hi, Jacob.
Hi, Jacob.
Again.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that probably every time until you tell me to stop at knife point.
Good lord, we're not gonna get views. Anyway, do you know why we're here today, Jacob?
No, I have no idea. Please tell me why you tied me to this chair.
Okay, well, in case you didn't know, we're here to react and review to the movie Horror Express, released in 1972, starring Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Telly Savalas. I suppose you already know about this because you watched it, didn't you?
Yes, I did in fact watch this film.
Thank God, because that's the whole premise of the podcast.
Ah, yes, I'm so glad I wandered into this recording studio instead of the one over Mamma Mia.
Yeah, well, we can do that too if we have time. But anyway, this movie is considered a creature feature. And it was directed by, who was it directed by? Eugenio Martin? Is that how you pronounce it?
I have no idea, and I just want to preface this entire episode with the fact
We're
that I'm
gonna
going to be
butcher
butchering names.
Butcher names. We're gonna do tri-tip, ribeye, prime rib, just butchering Russian, Chinese, and English names.
I'm going to try my best to refer to all of the characters by their character names, but failing that, I'm probably going to call them by the actors' names, especially since the cast is so enormous in terms of popularity.
Telly Savalas will be referred to as Telly Savalas because his character is so great in this film. He does not need a character name because he is playing 100% Telly Savalas. Perhaps we should get into a little bit of why we chose this movie. As some of you may know, when I go online to look at movies, I go through a lot of lists and pick out what I think is something that hasn't gotten enough appreciation. People haven't looked at it. And when I came across Horror Express, it almost baffled me. It has all these big names with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, not just in film, but in horror film especially. They're pretty big names, and I haven't heard this movie. Most times when you think of Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee, you associate them with the Hammer horror films, the House of Dracula, Curse of Frankenstein, The Mummy, those films. Or if you're a Star Wars fan, you think of them as being from Star Wars. Would you agree with that, Jacob?
Oh, yes, definitely. And of course, Christopher Lee is very famous for Saruman in Lord of the Rings as well.
Yes, and one thing I love about this movie is it does a really good job having Christopher Lee do the opening narration for the film, and it kind of made a little cherry on top for me. That's why I liked it. So what were your thoughts going into this movie?
Mainly, I was curious as to how they were going to utilize the train as a setting in a horror film, because train horror is
Very niche.
kind of a very niche subgenre of horror where you have all of the characters trapped in this one confined setting and they can't really get away. Interestingly enough, that shares certain similarities with the movie Devil by M. Night Shyamalan, which I'm going to reference when we get later into the film. So I was curious how that was going to play out, if it was going to be a whodunit or a slasher or some other kind of mystery.
I agree. I had the Devil in the back burner of my mind, but it never came to the forefront. I was mostly thinking of another movie, which we'll discuss after we go over the synopsis and plot of this movie, in particular because I believe it's more prevalent, but that's a good association to make with it as well.
Yes, and we'll probably save that for the post-summary discussion, but my guess is you're referring to The Thing, aren't you?
Yes, and we got a lot of ground to cover with that, so I'm excited about it. So, Jacob, one of the things that I really enjoyed about this was the vibe. They don't really make movies like this anymore. I really enjoyed the intimate train setting juxtaposed to the very cold outdoors of Trans-Siberia. I really love, again, just how the setting is played and how the greatest horror is inside this cozy train, but a greater horror is in the cold wilderness of Siberia and in Russia.
Yes, so contrary to the fact that they are in this very cold environment with these swirling snow winds outside, for me, this film felt very warm and very intimate for most of it, and every now and then you get a little glimpse of that cold exterior.
And
But
you
there's,
feel it. You
yeah,
feel
and
it
you
when
feel
that door opens.
and there's always something very mysterious and very unnerving about a vast frozen wasteland. There are a lot of horror films and horror novellas and short stories that deal with, say, Antarctica. And for some reason, there's just an inherent deep mystery to that.
Yeah, I totally agree. The music in particular really helps set the tone for this. You have this almost disco beat, but the theme that goes along the movie through the whole thing is this ambient whistling noise that just sends shivers down my spine. But I loved it at the same time.
Oh,
and
yes.
I love that it's incorporated with the main bad guy.
That was probably my first thought when I began watching this film was, oh my gosh, I love that whistling motif. It is absolutely haunting. And as you just said, it's not just part of the soundtrack of the film, it's actually whistled by some of the characters and eventually by the, if you want to call them the villain or the creature, whatever, the entity around which this film is comprised.
And the music being so varied and just mashed together really puts you in this uncomfortable state, just like how the guests on the train kind of are. If you think about it, a train is a point A and point B system. When the train is moving, you are basically nowhere and everywhere at the same time, which can really add, if it's done right in a plot, it can really add a sense of dread for these passengers because they're everywhere and nowhere at the same time and kind of in this in-between place where they are most vulnerable. And that's where the movie succeeds with me, because you have these people who are traveling and they are at this most vulnerable where they don't have any sort of home field advantage in a very unforgiving Russian wilderness, and they're being attacked in the one place they know they're supposed to be safe.
Yes, and as a little bit of a side note onto that, I feel like that's probably why trains are used so often in horror to represent the journey into the afterlife, because it is that place of transition where you're in this confined space, but you're not really anywhere. You're kind of in this nothing. So I definitely agree with that, and it adds a lot to the atmosphere. Before we drift too far away from the soundtrack, I do just want to say that I've always found there to be something inherently terrifying in having a monster or a villain of some kind that just likes to whistle a jolly tune or hum or sing or something like that. You see this fairly frequently, like with the Beast from Over the Garden Wall. There's the head, the Mitai Doti Walker head from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark,
Ooh,
which I
that
love.
scares me.
Gantaro Dim from The Witcher. The fact that the villain is just like either so comfortable with themselves or so beyond comprehension that they just walk around producing this music. It shows that they have an intelligence, that they're not just a mindless force of death or something, and that makes them so much scarier and so much more intriguing.
And the fact that they can sing on key is just the cherry on the cake.
Oh yeah.
I feel like it just really sets it up to make you feel inferior. You may be tone deaf, but this guy that's about to kill you can sing on key and on pitch.
They should make a horror film where the villain goes around singing really, really terribly. And that's how you know he's near, is you hear like some horrible rendition of Single Ladies slowly creeping down the hallway.
Well, they kind of did it in the movie A Clockwork Orange with Singing in the Rain.
Yeah, not a horror film, I wouldn't say, but that's a very good movie.
It is a good movie, but again, they did utilize the singing, and it wasn't great singing, but I feel like Charlie Pluth would play that because he's constantly known for correcting people's singing. They'll yell or something, he'll be like, oh, that was an A minor. Do that again. I want to put that on a track.
Dylan Golden, 2022. That was a minor. Do it again.
Did you have any other thoughts to add before we get into the synopsis?
I think we can probably go ahead and get into the synopsis. I definitely have a lot of thoughts on this movie, but I think we can touch on them as we go.
Okay, well, we'll get right into it then. Our movie opens in Szechuan, China in 1906. I had to look up the translation just to make sure that it was Szechuan, China in 1906 because this movie was filmed in Spain for Spaniards, and for some reason it takes place in Russia, but you also have Chinese people, Italian people, British people, so you have this melting pot, and I feel like that's one of the reasons the movie didn't catch on in Spain and no one liked it there as much, but it caught on really well, just like Carnival of Souls did with late night television in America, and it developed a cult following almost as similar, and I'm really appreciative that it did that. I feel like we're starting to see a lot of these movies that were forgotten to time that were just brought back by local stations that had nothing to show but in the public domain films, and that's what they did, and these movies, for better or worse, garnered a cult following for how they were presented.
It's like a time capsule. You find this old shoebox buried under the ground, and it doesn't really matter what's in it, right? It could be a couple marbles, or it could be $1,000 baseball card. The cool thing is that you found this old dusty box and you get to see what's in it. And sometimes you find hidden gems.
So, as we're described by the narrator, who is also Christopher Lee, this story is based on true events, allegedly. And this is sort of, I didn't get so much of a Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibe with this is based on true events. I got more of a Frankenstein type vibe from it, the original story. Because that's inherently supposed to be some sort of true event that happened. A lot of the motifs, mostly the cold, unforbidding setting and the monster, play into that assumption, I believe, as well. And from there, we are introduced to our main character, Christopher Lee, in a beautiful mustache, wearing a Russian... What would you call that hat? A muff?
I'm just gonna call it a hat. But I'm more concerned with what we're calling Christopher Lee, because for those of you who've not seen this movie, he's not in fact Christopher Lee in the film. He's a professor by the name of Saxton.
Alexander Saxton.
So just in case you're confused, this is not a biographical film.
It should be. I feel like at this point we don't have that kind of credibility. It could be about Christopher Lee. It could be about his made-up character. It could be about Christopher Lee playing Whitney Houston experiencing these events.
I'd like to see that.
It has the same amount of credibility.
Anyway, Professor Saxton is going on an anthropological journey in this frozen area, and he discovers what seems to be the fossil of some ancient primate, which is where we get the first glimpse of what's ultimately going to become our monster. Now, what were you thinking at this stage in the film?
It's interesting they had to tell us it was a prehistoric primate person, because I just saw it as some sort of skeleton, because we just see the eye and the exposed teeth.
Yes, I thought it was just a skeleton as well. It wasn't until we got to some of the later scenes where we get a closer look at this thing that I realized it was some form of ape-like creature. I just thought it was a dead guy.
And I don't believe it's really necessarily apt to call it the ape, because it's a lot more of just a creature than an ape. But I don't want, of course, we'd like for people to watch these movies along with us, but if you haven't seen it, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as an ape, like Murder at the Rue Morgue type ape where it's an actual ape. I would think caveman, but less developed.
Yeah, it's some form of primitive primate-descended humanoid life form.
Number 3 on the person evolution chart.
Yes, which is the reason that this professor, our main character, is so interested in the fossil, because he believes it might represent a missing link in the theory of evolution. So he packages it up and he's trying to transport it back to somewhere where he can study it and perhaps be recorded in the annals of academic history.
So from here we cut to the crate that is all locked up and covered in some sort of tarp at a train station, and it's being guarded by someone as Dr. Saxton tries to get his ticket for the train. Now, I didn't really understand the significance of his struggle to get a train ticket. Do you have any insight to that you can can explain to me? Because I was kind of lost for that.
I don't think it is significant, but it establishes Saxton's character very well. So what happens is he's going in and he's trying to get his ticket, and we have a fairly elongated scene where we're introduced to Peter Cushing's character of Dr. Wells, I believe.
Yes, and we're kind of established that they're rivals, right?
Friendly rivals, I would say.
Frenemies, yes.
They clearly get along and like each other, but they also have this tension between them where they're kind of trying to one up each other constantly. But Saxton is experiencing trouble with the gentleman at the train station who is supposed to be giving him his ticket. Essentially, this gentleman is not giving the professor the time of day. And I personally love this scene because eventually Saxton gets so fed up with this man that he just swipes all of the contents of his desk into the floor and is looking like he's about to square up with this guy. And just as he does this, a group of guards with their captain come in on the side of Christopher Lee, saying that they've been given orders to help him in any way they can. And so the ticket man immediately changes his tune and starts kissing Professor Saxton's butt, frankly. Now, Dylan, I have my own thoughts on why I think this scene is important, but do you want to give your impression first?
Well, it establishes the character. It also establishes the relationship he has with Wells, which is frenemies. I feel like the script lended itself for them more to be direct rivals, but with two actors like Cushing and Lee who have so much charm and chemistry, you can't make them full enemies against each other.
Yes.
Even Star Wars couldn't do it. They were both on the dark side.
And as you mentioned at the beginning there, this helps to establish character. What I really like is what it says about Saxton's character. He seems to be a very personally motivated, matter-of-fact, and dedicated to what he believes is just. And we see this happening later, not to flash forward too much, but there's going to be a scene later in the film where he is being accosted by some guards and an inspector to relinquish an item that he possesses. And rather than give them this item, he throws it out the window. Keep in mind, this gentleman is at gunpoint. He's just such a dedicated and personally motivated character. I feel like we don't see that enough. Not in film and not in the real world either. So it just made me instantly like him.
Yes, he has no real moment of self-doubt. Even when things get to a point where a regular person would make several leaps in logic, he takes that and just says, yes, that's how it is. That's exactly how it is. And he doesn't feel the need to explain himself or why he necessarily thinks that or get people on his side. You're either on board with him or you're not. And being the original, you either do this or I'll knock all this shit over person is a really good embodiment of this character and who we'll come to know. Whereas you have the juxtaposition of his colleague Wells, who I would say as far as the film goes is depicted as having just a bit more charm and a little bit more tact about things, whereas Saxton is more willing to make a scene, let's say, and has some issues with his own patience.
That is true, but for me personally, Dr. Wells's, as you call it, charm came off more to me as sliminess. Like the kind of person that tries to solve situations socially, but in a way that is overtly underhanded and manipulative. Sort of like the film was trying to tell me that this guy is suave, but actually he just came off as a little bit creepy. That's how I interpreted it.
Yes, and I think that's due in part to Cushing as a wonderful character actor. And that's one thing I will also credit this movie. It utilizes character actors very well and plays to their strengths. I know last week we discussed the character of Miss Thomas and how she was a good character actress and that a lot of her personal presence came on screen and just made for a delightful viewing, and I would say the same for this movie. A lot of the actors, even if the characters aren't necessarily written memorably, they're performed memorably and engagingly.
Oh, I would agree with that. Frankly, just about every single character that isn't an extra in this film has a very memorable performance.
At the same time as this scene is going on at the train station, the guard who's guarding Saxton's crate is distracted by another gentleman, and we see this gentleman try to pick the lock. And then we go back to the ticket booth where we're having this interaction, and Saxton is informed by the guards that they've been sent to help him in any means necessary.
Yes, and immediately following this scene where Saxton finally gets his ticket, they go outside and they see the result of this attempted thievery, which is the thief appears to have been killed in some way, or at least to have died, and his eyes are a blank white and covered in veins. It seems like his eyes have almost been fried.
And that throughout the course of the movie, we see people die in this manner. What did you think of this as a special effect? And what do you think about this method of showing people being dead? For me, it was really effective. I think because I have this thing about eyes. This movie plays with eye horror in some very special ways that you wouldn't expect. Because a lot of movies, whenever they do eye horror, they think we'll just stick a needle in the eye or something along those lines. But there are other ways to achieve it, and I believe this movie is a study in messing with eye color to provoke a emotional response.
So first of all, if you're feeling disappointed, don't worry. There is still a needle in the eye in this film.
Yes.
But you're right. A lot of the horror in this film is derived from the eyes, and in a lot of different ways. First of all, I will say that I found it to be effective. There is certainly something inherently scary about things messing with your eyes, and as we'll find out later, it also involves the brain. Apart from that, I feel the same way about the eye effects that I feel about essentially all of the special effects in this film, which is that they are simultaneously really hokey and bad, and also very effective at accomplishing horror. Because you look at them and you know at the surface level that it looks really silly. As I said, the eyes look fried. Frankly, they kind of look like fried eggs. And we're going to see a different eye effect later that essentially looks like glowing red arcade machine lights. And yet it creates this uncanny valley effect that really creeps you out and disturbs you. And personally, I kind of wanted to look away from the screen sometimes when these eyes were on there, just because I did not like what I was looking at.
It's one of those uncanny valley things where the effects are bad and then they loop back around to being good and effective, especially when you have blood dripping from the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth. That really shocked me. And the expression on these people's face is as though they died of fear. And a small part of me really wish, because I'm a big Harry Potter fan, I really wish whenever they did the killing curse, since they do die of fear, we had something like that. I feel like that would have been awesome.
I can agree with that. And I don't. Weirdly enough, that's not the only tie-in that this episode might have with Harry Potter, because the scene where they take off from this train station, I swear, it looks exactly like the Hogwarts Express scene. I don't know if you thought that.
I think it's just the British people and the fact that it's a train.
Okay, that's fair.
And the fact that also the setting of this train station does a really good job of making it seem like this cultural melting pot. And you have all these different people trying to get from one place to another. I found that very effective. Whereas in a lot of movies you see train stations, you pretty much see the same type of person in terms of extras. But this truly felt like what you would expect a train station to be, with Asian people, Russians, British people, Americans, animals. It was just really effective for me, and something that I wouldn't have expected from a movie of this caliber.
Yes, that is the first thing that I do anytime I visit a train station, is I take a survey of the ethnicity of all of the people around me. And I can verify that this is in fact a realistic depiction of a train station.
Well, I just mean different people doing different things. Even if you go to an airport now, you'll see someone dressed in a three-piece suit, and then you'll see someone wearing a Disney World 1992 oversized shirt with shorts and a fanny pack. But in movies, they all pretty much look the same because they're all extras, and the main point of extras is to not draw focus away from the shot or the main character or for the main action. And this movie felt like you could pick out one person that was an extra and they could have their own story.
No, I agree with you. I was just being playful. You're right. A lot of train station scenes that we get in films, it's always just a whole bunch of British gentlemen in black jackets and top hats walking around with briefcases, and Voldemort standing in the background. But this one is like a lovely mixture of that traditional sort of train station scene and also the bustling undercity type of scene where you know that around every corner there's a different little vignette you can fall into.
Yes. Now, whenever the guards or policemen or what have you go to inspect this person who has died, they say that he is blind. But we come to learn from one of the people at the train station that that couldn't be. He was one of the best locksmiths, that he could break into anything.
Yes, and they refer to him as a locksmith, which I assume is accurate, but just to be clear, what he was doing in this case was lock picking and trying to steal Professor Saxton's package.
That could have easily been a translation issue. There are sometimes people say something and you follow the context of what they're saying, but not necessarily the actual meaning. Like they call people little father a lot.
Yes. Now,
I noticed that, and I didn't really understand the context for it.
I mean, he very well may have been a legitimate locksmith. A locksmith would, of course, be able to pick locks. It just came off as strange to me that they would refer to that like it was his profession and simultaneously be aware that he was a career criminal, right? Like, oh yeah, Dave down the street, the locksmith, he steals shit all the time.
Yeah, he'll fix your lock, but he's also going to take everything you have, so it's give and take.
He'll fix your lock,
the door
but
is
you won't need it anymore. There's not going to be anything, you're safe.
4 stars. He unlocked my door, but he also took the TV.
And this is also when we're introduced to 3 more of our main cast of characters. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is the Count, the Countess, and our lovely, esteemed father. Could you please pronounce that for me? I'm having trouble.
Pujardov.
Yes, Pujardov. And again, we're probably butchering that. What did you think about Pujardov?
Besides him being a Rasputin stand-in?
Yeah, he's literally Rasputin. Like, just, again, maybe I'm ignorant, maybe there's another character that he's based on, but this dude straight up looks like Rasputin.
Yes, he has the big beard, he's Russian, and he has the wild eyes and the fanaticism, but maybe we're just describing other Russian monks.
Yeah, possible. I'm not too familiar with Russian history.
Remember how last week we alienated the Midwest?
I'm not worried about alienating deceased Russian monks, Dylan. I think we're fine on that count.
They live a long time. It took like 5 assassination attempts to kill Rasputin.
Yes, they did.
Do you really want those types of people coming after you?
I feel like we could have an interesting conversation.
But anyway, we get the idea that the monk, Pujardov, has a lot of opinions about faith. In fact, every line of dialogue he has to do with faith. And he is the first person to say something really isn't right about whatever's in that crate. And he does this wonderful little example where wherever God is, the cross can also be, or something to that effect. And he takes out a regular piece of chalk and draws it on the ground to show everyone. And then he raises it to the crate and draws a cross, but the cross isn't there. What did you think about this going into it? Without knowing how the rest of the story pans out, what did you think about the introduction of this religious aspect to the story?
So I'm probably going to talk about this for too long. There are 2 different perspectives
That's why we're here.
that you can have on this. The first is watching the film for the first time and thinking about the logic of this scene in the moment. And then the second perspective is having finished the film, thinking back and asking yourself, wait a minute, what was going on here? So for the first perspective, I was a little bit confused because I'm just curious as to how that works in a physical sense. Like, does the devil know that he's about to draw a cross? And so he's just like, no, you can't put chalk on that canvas. That's not allowed. Like, what if he was going to play tic-tac-toe instead?
That's graffiti.
I feel like maybe he should have drawn the cross and then it should have crumbled onto the ground or faded away or something. Being unable to draw it at all was just a little bit goofy, especially since, like, the literal next shot is of the chains wrapped around the box, which inadvertently form a cross. I don't know if you noticed that. I don't think it was intentional, but it just made me think, well, why didn't the devil get rid of those chains?
Maybe that's what was binding him.
My second point of confusion with this scene. Now, uh, do you want me to talk about it now, or should we wait till the end? Because it involves things we learn about the characters later.
Well, first, I would kind of like to interject. The whole conversation with Pajardov and the cross is very similar, like you said, to the devil, now that you think about it. There's this one scene where this random-ass guy... Spoiler alert for the devil. If you haven't watched it, go watch it.
I'm talking about this. This was mine
Okay.
in the show notes, and this is stupid. Yes, this is very,
Are you going to talk about the jelly on the toast scene?
This is very reminiscent of the M. Night Shyamalan jelly side down test from the movie Devil, which, if you're not familiar with that film, it's a whole bunch of people, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's a whole bunch of people trapped in an elevator together, and they start dying, and they have to figure out who the killer is. And there is this crazy security guard character in that film who is convinced that the devil is at play in this situation. And he explains that the way you can tell the devil is near is that if you put jelly on toast and you drop it, it will always fall jelly side down. The implication being that the devil's presence makes bad things happen. But it's just such a ridiculous and simultaneously iconic concept. And as our little Rasputin stand-in was drawing a cross chalk, or a chalk cross, on this canvas, or tarp, I just couldn't help but think about Mr. Jelly Side Down.
So what you're saying is Martine walked so Shyamalan could run.
Yes. That is probably not what I'm saying at all, but I'm going to agree with it because it sounds right.
In my mind, perhaps Shyamalan was working off the logic that Martine did in this scene, but I want to give props where props are due. Martine, in my opinion, did it better. Pajardov's little cross thing was more effective, perhaps because the character doing it is creepy, and at this point in the movie, I was thinking, okay, what's going to be worse? Whatever's in this crate, or this creepy-ass priest monk. Because I could probably deal with the prehistoric ape thing before I see that monk guy, because if I see Rasputin in a long train hallway, I'm going to start booking it to the other end.
I'm not going to talk about the various reasons that I don't think the jelly side down toast worked, because that would involve spoiling some of the movie Devil. But I will agree with you that Martine does it much, much better. One reason being that it contains actual religious symbolism. I mean, I think that the devil is he's probably less inclined to enjoy a crucifix than he is a piece of toast. And secondly, it's kind of hard to take something seriously when Satan and jelly are mentioned in the same sentence.
I'll agree, and I just want to have it on record. I'm really enjoying this conversation because talking about Horror Express and Devil, we're having a very deep-cut conversation here.
Yeah.
Like two things that people just kind of toss aside. This is a very deep-cut conversation and the type that this podcast was meant for.
Go watch Devil. I do not recommend it at all, but you need to see it.
It's a film that needs to be cut, but it's M. Night Shyamalan, so all of his movies after 2002 have just basically been a parody of M. Night Shyamalan.
It's full of Shyamalan-isms where, like, you'll pan over a cityscape, but it's upside down for some reason, and you can tell he's trying to be super symbolic, but it just doesn't make any sense.
Because it's a twist.
What the twist?
What a twist.
I don't want to come off as negative, but I've forsaken that man ever since the last Airbender film, so I don't really care.
I believe we all have. But anyway, we are here to talk about Horror Express and not M. Night Shyamalan.
Yes. As I said, I do have another point that I'd like to make about this crucifix scene, but I do think it would be better to discuss it later into the film, because it involves a pretty significant revelation that I don't think we should discuss right now.
Okay. One thing I wanted to bring up real quick before we move on from the train station to actually get onto the train was when the guards are tasked with moving the crate, and then they also move the body, and there's no questions asked.
You're referring to the
about
body of the thief.
The thief, the lock picker. there was no conversation, there was no investigation. The guy said, "Okay, boys, on three. 1, 2, 3." And 4 guys picked up the crate. And then 2 came right in front of them, grabbed the body, and moved it off a camera, which I just thought was kind of funny. You know, this is what you do in Russia.
The law enforcement and the science in this film
This is not a procedural
are
movie.
both pretty shaky. And we'll get to the science part later. But yeah, there's some things happen in this film that are pretty suspicious. Or as the kids would say nowadays, that's pretty sus.
That means gay.
I don't know. Are you being
That
serious?
means gay.
It does not.
Yes, it means gay.
Yeah, it can
If
mean
something's
gay.
being...
Among Us,
If
Dylan.
something's... Yes, I know it's Among Us, but if someone's being sus, it's referred to them being gay.
That is not the primary use case of that term.
It's the... Okay, Gen Zers, sound off in the comments. Give us 5 stars, but correct us.
Yeah, so you just let me know if you say someone is sus, is the primary interpretation of that they are gay. I do not believe that. I am happy to be wrong.
Okay, so we finally get onto the train, and this is where we get to be introduced to the characters in a less formal sense, and we get to see these characters interact and how their different personalities come together, which I was really excited for, to see these characters be fleshed out personally. And one of the big aspects of this was we were introduced to the sleeping cabinet of Dr. Saxton, not to be confused with the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which at some point I do expect us to cover. And we find out that he has to share a cabin with Dr. Wells, his nemesis. And look out, sitcom land, a new shipment of funnies on its way.
Oh yes, now in the meantime we are introduced to another member of our main cast. I believe she goes by the name of Natasha, is that correct?
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit about Natasha?
Yes, Natasha, in my mind, she almost played off as a femme fatale type character, and she also plays as sort of a foil between Wells and Saxton's characters, respectively. She is apparently a stowaway on this train, and she basically just tells them, "Hey, be cool, I don't have a ticket, I need to stay somewhere." And Wells is really excited about this idea, but not so much so sharing a room with Saxton. And in not so few words, Wells basically tells Saxton, "Hey, you're caught blocking me here." But Saxton just really doesn't care and doesn't like this individual and just asserts himself saying, "I'm top bunk." And throws his stuff on top of his bed.
I absolutely loved this scene. I just want to say it felt like something you would see in a stupid high school to college age raunch comedy, except it's being acted by Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, and they're both relatively old men on a creepy train. It just felt so out of place, but in such a lovely way. Because Cushing, if you got a different impression, please let me know. Cushing gave me the impression that he was just, like you said, super excited to have this stowaway woman in his cabin, and is like trying really hard to be alone with her. And then Saxton comes in and is like, "Hey, this is my bunk too."
It doesn't help either that Natasha as a character is endued with so much sex appeal. She is drinking the Viagra water from the James Bond girls. She mentioned several times that she will be very accommodating to these men.
Yes, she does, and you're right that she presents herself as a little bit of a femme fatale character, but I don't want to overstate it. She's really not sexualized, I wouldn't say.
No,
it's more so that she's just playing her role as a spy.
Yes, and I would even argue that she does more with the role than you would expect it to be written on paper. Clearly, she is a sexy character, but it's not played to a comic relief like a Jessica Rabbit type or even a Bond girl. Imagine a more subtle Bond girl. Which, by the way, I just want to state, going off what you said, having these 2 men kind of having this tit for tat with her in the room, it plays very comedically. And it's not something you'd expect from this caliber of actor, or even this caliber of person. If you think about it, Christopher Lee, he saw The Last Execution in France. He was a Nazi killer. He released a metal album when he was 80. This man is like the OG. He's the greatest. I'm a huge fan of Christopher Lee, not only as an actor, but as a person. He's just phenomenal. He was one of the last people to know J.R.R. Tolkien before he died. They were actually friends. And fun fact, he was actually supposed to play Gandalf.
Yep. Tolkien said that he should play Gandalf. Now, the audiences of obscure horror films and high fantasy may not necessarily overlap,
They do.
but I think we're probably preaching to the choir here. Like, I think most people probably know how awesome Christopher Lee is. He's basically the world's real most interesting man, like from the Dos Equis commercials.
Mm-hmm.
That should have just been Christopher Lee.
Last thing, while we're talking about James Bond, he was actually the model for that too. Ian Fleming wrote the character of James Bond based on him.
Which is really ironic because Telly Savalas, who's going to play a character that we're introduced to later, was Blofeld in one of the James Bond movies post Sean Connery. So Christopher Lee is acting in a film with a guy who played in a film based on novels that were based on Christopher Lee. That is just a crazy mind
Jeremy Bearimy.
cluster. Yeah.
It's a Jeremy Bearimy.
You know what I'm trying to say.
Yes. And from this scene, it basically ends in a wash, where our main characters of Wells and Saxton are gonna have this debate, and it ends at a standstill, with them staying in the room together. And then we cut to another cabin, a larger cabin that's a lot prettier, where the Count and the Countess are. And I don't think it was explicitly stated in the beginning, but the monk is with them, which makes sense when I think about it, but I didn't make that connection that they were together.
I didn't either, but much in the vein of Rasputin, he is sort of their spiritual advisor. He tries to make sure that their immortal souls remain intact.
I don't know if I could hang with him or not. He just seems like a letdowner. I wouldn't take him on trips with me. I get needing a spiritual advisor for things. But this man, every time he's on screen, he's talking about the devil. He's talking about going to hell. It's just a huge letdown.
No. That I would much rather hang out with this guy than with the Count or the Countess. This guy can definitely party. As long as you're partying in the name of God, you're gonna get absolutely wasted. Like, just look at him.
I guess it's the toss-off. Because, on one hand, you're incredibly rich, you have all this stuff at your disposal, but at the same time, you have Joel Osteen on TV 24/7 in the room. It's one of those would you press the button things. You have everything you could ever want, but there is a hellfire preacher that plays non-stop, and only you can hear it.
That's basically what it's like to be me. That's what it's like inside my head. I should probably get that checked.
This show will resume in 72 hours after a psych evaluation.
I've already had a psych evaluation, thank you. The government thinks I'm A-okay.
Does that say something about you or the government?
Both. But yeah, no, I'm serious. Like, you know that I'm just going to call him Rasputin, unless you don't want me to. You know that Rasputin is having some kind of crazy, like, spiritual incense orgies and stuff like that, right? Like, there's no doubt about it.
Yes, if any of you have seen the show The Great, he reminds me of their spiritual advisor as well. I think that was just the fashion at the time, creepy monk man.
All right, I'm going to do this for the benefit of the both of us and everyone listening. Pujardov, 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 Pujardov.
Thank God.
I think we've got it now.
Pujardov. Except it's Russian, so the ooh almost sounds like an ah. Pujardov. Pujardov.
Yeah, I'm not gonna take the pronunciation.
It's like a soft A, hate fucked a lowercase u. Pujardov.
I like that I didn't want to say the word mindfuck, and then we went into spiritual orgies and hate. So I guess that's out the window.
Hand
right?
in hand.
Just like the key.
So, The Countess excuses herself at about the same time Dr. Saxton excuses himself. In some of the credits, he's listed as Sir Dr. Alexander Saxton, which just sounds like a reference from SpongeBob where he said Mr. Dr. Professor Patrick.
Yes, or The Secret Show, if you ever watched The Secret Show. But anyway, they in the film itself, they do call him Sir.
Yes.
So it's not just in the text.
So Sir Dr. Saxton is in the hallway with the Countess, and they have this sort of meet cute. And you can tell they have more of a connection than, say, he and Natasha did. And I really liked them together. It's almost a pity they didn't end up together, or they didn't advance any sort of romantic interest, because this scene was kind of cute, seeing her whimsical vibe about her mixed with Christopher Lee's hardened, edgy, matter-of-factness, this is how it is mentality. If this movie were made today, it would probably be about 2 hours long, and we might get that sub-story.
Yeah, and I probably wouldn't have liked it. I really don't like when romance is shoehorned into every film. Horror is a genre. Romance is a genre. Westerns are a genre. Now, I personally am not too much a fan of genres in general. I kind of wish we would just tell stories. But why is romance always shoehorned into everything?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily romance. It just more establishes that the Countess, she's married to the Count more for the money than anything else, because they don't seem to have a whole lot of chemistry. The Count is older, she's younger, and this sort of implies that she's a flirt and isn't afraid to do something behind her husband's back if she can get away with it. In all their scenes together, her and the Count, she's just more aloof. She's almost like she's half listening. She always has something in her lap, she's doing something. And I could swear there's some scenes in here where she almost rolls her eyes at Pajaridov and the Count, like she's having the worst travel weekend ever.
I can see that, but at the end of the day, she's not really that important of a character, so her being kind of aloof and removed is not particularly consequential. I also don't think that you can claim, that they don't end up together or anything like that, given the way that this film ends.
The next big set of scenes takes place in, I guess, the storage cart where the crate is kept, but it's also where they keep the valuables safe. And we see Wells having an odd curiosity about the crate, and he offers to pay the porter or the luggage man to drill a hole in it so he could see what was inside. And it's at the same time that Wells meets the Countess, and she has something in her hand that needs to be put into the valuables safe. And we don't really know what it is, and they don't really go into it right then, but she puts it up, and the only other significant thing in this scene is that she has a dog with her, and the dog is very visibly shaken and scared by whatever's in the crate.
Yes, continuing with the theme of there being something evil in the crate. Ooh, spooky evil.
So from here, the porter decides he's going to help take off some bolts and whatnot and take a look inside of the crate. And it is there that the same fate befalls him as befalls the locksmith. And in my notes, I have this being more effective because we get to see it. We get to see the blood start to run. We get to see the sensation of fear that plays out on him, and the eyes change. Now, for me, probably the most effective look in this was when you can still see the pupils and the irises, but it's almost fogged over. For me, that was almost more effective with the blood.
Yes, and if I remember correctly, yes, the blood. If I remember correctly, there's sort of bleeding out the eyes as well, which is always something that I'm not going to call it phobic, because I think that's a pretty rational thing to be afraid of, but bleeding out of orifices you shouldn't be bleeding out of is something that's always given me a little bit of a shock.
I don't understand why. They're bleeding orifices, get over it. But from this scene, we see him die, and then Wells and Saxton are called into the luggage cart. And we see the guards are all there, and they show them the body. And they ask him what was in that crate. And this is where we get the bigger explanation that it's a 2-million-year-old fossil.
Yes, now before we get too far into this scene, I just had something else I wanted to say about the previous scene, because it really stood out to me.
What's that?
When I was watching it. At the time, I was still not completely sure what this entity in the box was. Because as you and I both agreed, when we first saw it in the opening scene, it kind of just looked like a skeleton. And so, in my mind, I was sitting here watching this thinking, you know, this might be the first time I've seen a zombie lockpicking scene. That's a that's a little weird. Why does this zombie know how to pick locks? And then with the knowledge that we ultimately obtain later in the film, I had to amend that to, huh, that was an ancient evil zombie monkey lockpicking scene. Which is somehow less weird, because I'm pretty sure we get that in Night at the Museum. But still, it was very strange.
In my head, I did make the connection because it did seem silly after the creature thing gets killed. You see a hand reach out from this little cubby window that it has and fish around a little side table that's there for some reason, and he finds a nail and he starts bending it. And in my head, I was thinking, this is ridiculous. How does this 2 million-year-old whatever know how to pick a lock? And then I remembered that the man that he killed was a locksmith, lockpicker, what have you. And it kind of made a bit more sense, and I thought, okay, this is... So he's absorbing skills, perhaps? And that made sense why he would kill the porter, because now the porter has a working knowledge of the train. So that would benefit him also. You can go on a tangent arguing the happenstance of it, that he was able to kill a locksmith and a train porter.
Well, the train porter thing isn't a coincidence. He's on a train.
Yes, but the locksmith part, perhaps.
It is a little bit convenient, but what I love about this is that when you watch through it for the first time, you lack the necessary knowledge to understand that these scenes actually make perfect sense. You watch it for the first time and you're thinking, this is ridiculous. Who the hell thought of this? And then when you're done with the movie, you think back to it and you're like, oh, that made perfect sense. That I understand what's happening all along now.
Yes, I feel like there's a tendency in creature features, especially ones made before a certain time, where you just expect that sort of schlock to come into play and not be resolved or be made sense of. But this movie did the work to actually make that make sense.
Yeah, we probably shouldn't talk about this for too much longer because people who haven't seen the movie aren't going to know what we're referring to. But I was fully prepared to accept that this ancient evil zombie monkey just knew how to pick locks because this is a hokey late 60s horror film. And I was very pleasantly surprised that it not only had a justification, but it had a justification that was like directly tied to the plot.
Yeah, well, spoiler alert, I'm just really glad that he doesn't kill Wells or Saxton, because then he'd learn vital knowledge about the dark side.
Yes. I can't wait to see the King Kong use the Force. That would be a terrifying movie.
So we're back in the cart where we found the porter's body, and Christopher Lee looks into the crate that has the little window and sees that it's empty and that whatever it is gone. And here he makes this realization that the creature that was in there is now alive and moving about the train, which is a giant leap in logic, but he doesn't treat himself like he's crazy, which is funny, because I feel like a lot of lesser products would have him go on a crazy rampage and everybody thinks he's crazy and they quarantine him or something like that, but they don't. He's just like, yeah, it's moving about the cabin, it's moving about the whole train, and this is the way it is. Yeah. And they try to get him to unlock the thing, and he just takes the damn key, like you said, and just tosses it out the window at gunpoint, like, what you gonna do? Or,
arguably, you could say it was at butt point. Because they aren't holding the barrel to him, but the butt of the gun. I'm making that...
In Soviet Russia, you don't shoot the gun, the gun shoots you.
I am making that clarification solely so I can say the word butt point. It's not important to the plot at all.
Oh no, but I'm surprised we're how far into this podcast and we've just now made a Soviet Russia joke?
Well, I mean, that was you. So, the night is young.
In Soviet Spain? The night is young.
Yeah, well, regarding the investigation scene, I want to talk about some of the astounding leaps in logic that some of the characters in this film make. There are several times where Saxton seems to magically acquire knowledge about the plot of this film. He sees that the scene that is laid out before him, and he comes very quickly to the conclusion that this creature must still be alive and is going on a rampage somewhere on the train. And what's even worse than that is the inspector just immediately believes him.
Yes, ands him like this is some sort of improv.
It's exactly right. It feels like an improv session. So let's look at the evidence here. You have this professor who is very desperate for you, a law enforcement officer, not to look in this crate. And he is so concerned about you looking in this crate that he throws the key out the window at gunpoint, or at butt point. And then you break open the crate and find a dead man inside. And the guy who was so desperate for you not to open the crate says, "Oops, I guess it was a 2 million-year-old gorilla that killed him." And you, the law enforcement officer, say, "Yes, this is a problem. We must search the train. I hope we can do so without creating a panic." Dude, how did you get this job?
I feel like you're not going to create a panic so much as a, huh? What? Back up.
This very, very trustworthy gentleman who didn't want me to find the body that he hid has told me there is a gorilla on the loose. We need to find the gorilla.
Well, it's at this point that I notice with the story that Wells and Alexander, our characters, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, they're putting probably more into this performance than they needed to. Being already established names, they're incredible at pretty much like we were talking about yes-anding this whole story. I heard there was some improv to the movie, and I wouldn't be surprised if they just put their skills to use to just create better dialogue and characters for themselves inside of this scene with the ape now on the loose and everybody saying they have to keep everybody calm. Just their interactions with themselves versus their interaction with the guards, I just found pretty amazing. Especially since it's at this point we kind of have a turn in their dynamic where they now have to work together. Especially now that Wells knows that there's this prehistoric ape creature on the loose. Perhaps he's wanting it for himself. Perhaps he's just wanting to help. What do you make of this?
Make of what exactly? The dynamic between Cushing and Lee?
Do you believe that it's changed at this point?
It's certainly changed on the surface level. As we mentioned in the beginning, they clearly had some kind of past acquaintance, but it came off as a rivalry. To the point where Cushing's character, Dr. Wells, was bribing one of the train employees to drill a hole in another passenger's highly important luggage to see what was inside. Now, you can get away with bribing people for a lot of stuff, because people like money, but that seemed a bit extreme to me. And now they're very suddenly switched to working together and being on the same team and almost acting like old friends. I don't think it's really a plot hole or very necessarily even confusing, but it just reinforces the idea that these guys clearly have some kind of friendly rivalry. They're able to work together when they need to, and they're able to butt heads when they need to.
Well, yeah, Saxton's character, in his mind, he's found the discovery of a lifetime. Like, this is going to be his career. This is going to be his career-defining moment, finding this 2 million-year-old fossilized primordial ape man. And now this we'll see in a conversation later with, I think it's the Countess, talking about evolution and how this proves evolution. And then we get kind of a cool debate between them about evolution, which is interesting. During the time, I feel like that was a hot button topic. But from here, they introduce our side characters. After this scene, we have Alexander Saxton having his meal in his room by himself. And we have the food car where Wells and his assistant, Miss Jones, are having their meal with someone who says that they're an engineer. and also Natasha's there too. And I thought this engineer, for as little as he's in the movie, he was very effective for me. I liked him, except for the fact that everyone would always introduce him as, "Oh, are you a scientist?" "No, I'm actually an engineer."
Well, no, this is very strange because we meet this guy a little bit earlier in the film, and he talks to Saxton's character. And it's a very strange scene, I have to say, because he introduces himself, "I'm an engineer, a man of science," or something along those lines, as if we don't know that engineering is a science. And then he explains to Saxton that
How science works.
that this piece of chalk is a piece of chalk. Because that's something that all engineers know, is how to evaluate the composition of chalk.
And this is about 10 minutes later in the movie, so the point is moot at this point. It's like someone laughing 5 minutes after a joke's been told.
Yeah. And I'm not even sure why this gentleman is particularly invested in Rasputin's jelly side down test, but I think it's maybe supposed to be an ooh, creepy moment for the audience where they realize, it wasn't a trick. We're actually watching a horror movie. But I don't think it works.
Yes, I already did that mental legwork, so they didn't have to explain that.
It's named Horror Express.
Explain to me, though, how he got the damn chalk.
I'm really not sure.
It was small. It was a larger piece of chalk than the one that Pujardov had. So it wasn't the same piece of chalk.
Maybe we missed something. Maybe it showed him taking the chalk at some point. I didn't see it. But I guess I'm going to conclude that he has pickpocketed a piece of the chalk from Rasputin.
It's not instrumental to the plot. So the dinner car is having their meal, Alexander's having his meal by himself, and the Countess walks in and they have this conversation about what an important discovery this is for him and how it proves the stage of evolution. And the Countess comments how it's kind of a blasphemy. And it establishes Saxton's character more because he doesn't even entertain her side of the argument. He just states the facts that he knows and the facts he knows to be correct, and just kind of brushes off anything that she has to say about it because he knows he's right.
Again, going back to Saxton's character just being so headstrong, I love it. This was really ballsy for a movie made essentially in 1970.
Headstrong, but not stupid.
Yeah, not stupid headstrong like we get nowadays, but genuinely just firm and comfortable with himself and his beliefs. This man legitimately just says in a movie that was made in 1969, "Evolution is a fact. Facts do not contain morality." He went hard.
That was a good quote. I actually wrote that down too.
It's a very good quote. I mean, it's been usurped a little bit by people arguing in YouTube comments.
So while the adults are having their meal, we see a train car full of sleeping children, and the ape walks in. Now, it's more of a tension-building scene because the ape doesn't actually do anything to the people, or the sleeping children, rather. I guess, given what we know later in the story, that sort of comes into play. But while the adults are back enjoying their meal, Wells, for some reason, notes that the fish they're eating has white eyes, which I'm wondering, is Well thinking that whatever happened to the men also happened to the fish? And as far as a story device, are we to believe that this creature killed the fish to absorb its knowledge of oceanic life?
I don't know for sure, but my guess is probably not. I don't really see when the creature would have had the time and the opportunity to absorb these fish, and it doesn't seem particularly useful. I think it's probably more just a thematic connection showing that the characters are dwelling on what they've seen.
He brings it up to Natasha, and Natasha says, "Yes, it's boiled." And at this point I thought, how terrible of a time did you live in where boiled fish, not even descaled, not the head cut off or anything, was considered good food?
Don't knock it till you try it.
One of the stagecoach hands, or I think it's a guard, walks up to him while he's examining this fish and asks, "Are you a doctor?" And he replies with, "Ask me when I finish my dinner." And they basically tell him that there's been another murder or whatever's going on. And he says, yes, he's already seen the porter. But there is now another body requiring him, but he says he's going to need some help. So he finds his assistant, Miss Jones. And we don't really know much about Miss Jones, but I love this character so much. She's my everything. Whenever she tells Peter Cushing, Dr. Wells' character, I'm afraid I'm going to need your help, and her reply to him is, well, at your age, I'm not surprised. And he tells her there's been another murder, and she just gives a little shrug and says, okay. And from there, they decide they're going to do an autopsy on a guard that was found. While watching it, we don't see the guard. We just see the guard's body found, but he is killed in the exact same way, so we have an understanding of that this ape creature's been moving around a lot. From this autopsy scene, I want to say, for as far as gross out horror, this really affected me. Just listening to it in your headphones, there was this crunching sound. The sound guy really put his all into this scene in terms of what an autopsy would sound like. Just, you don't see so much of the action, but you see the saw scraping the bone and the scalpel pulling back the skin. Oh, it just sends me shivers. What did you think about the autopsy scene?
So I agree with you that the autopsy scene was very effective in terms of horror. Not necessarily for me because of the audio, but because of what we see underneath. The doctor, after removing the scalp, we get to take a look at this individual's brain. And the brain is completely smooth. There are no wrinkles at all. And the explanation that we get is that this means that all of that individual's memories and experiences have been sucked out. Not a brain surgeon, but I don't think that's how it works. But it's nevertheless very effective to just think of somebody sucking out your identity such that your brain is perfectly smooth and your eyes are white and just have this blank expression. It's very dread inducing if you're the kind of person that tries to empathize with the victims and think, what if that were me?
Theoretically, they explain the process of getting wrinkles and crevices in the brain. You get it with learning experiences, memory. That's where all that's stored, and that's why you have a rigid, wrinkly brain. And the more experiences and knowledge you gain, according to them, the more wrinkles you develop. Here, they're made smooth brain. In theory, I feel like it would be plausible, but in removing all those wrinkles, you're also removing stuff that the body just naturally uses, like the muscle memory of how to process urine and blood flow, all that stuff. He's also gaining that. So there's a bunch of junk files when whatever's happening to these people is absorbed.
As a little bit of a side note, one of the alternate titles for this film is, in Spanish, I believe Panic on the Trans-Siberian, or something like that. But when I was watching this film, I kept coming up with other alternate titles in my head. And
oh my gosh.
One of them was Rasputin and the Army of Smooth Brain. Which is going to make a lot more sense as we get later in the film. The other one was The Grim Adventures of Dooku and Tarkin.
Stop, I'm pissing.
So I was a little bit distracted by my own brain, having a little bit of fun.
Just tears me up. I love it. But anyway.
Yeah, back to the autopsy.
Back to the autopsy. They leave the autopsy room where the autopsy is being performed, and the side door opens and Snow rushes in, and we see the hand of the creature come down, as well as the rest of him, into the autopsy room, and he starts to examine this body. He looks at the brain, he looks at everything. So clearly he's gathering the knowledge that, oh shit, they're on to me. This scene was effective to me in that it brought in the cold, which is, you could say, is a bit of a changing point for the story. The elements are now inside of here, and it's not going to get better. Now, watching this, I didn't put together that the autopsy car and the storage car were the same car. Until, in this same scene, Natasha enters and the ape is hiding from her, and we find out why she's really here. She has the code to the storage safe, and she pulls out whatever the Countess had put in. And it's from here that Natasha is attacked by the creature, and the same thing happens to her. And this is our first case of a quote-unquote main character getting attacked. How did you feel about the effectiveness? I was honestly kind of shocked that this character, who they kind of established as one of the main players in the story, was killed. And for a movie of its time, I was almost sad to see her go.
I was too, and for a strange reason, I think that this actually works. You and I both know that when you go into a horror movie, you are expecting a majority of the main cast to die, right?
You expect those to have a bunch of stock characters too, people who are just there to die. And a lot of people accredit movies like Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street with making characters that you invest in emotionally to make their final death just a bit more jarring and emotional. And for a film of its time, I believe it's kind of revolutionary, because when people die in this movie outside of the first act, I'm actually upset that they're gone.
And because it doesn't really feel like your generic monster movie or slasher film. Even though at its core, you just have this monster walking around this enclosed area killing people. So from a plot perspective, it's not much different. And yet when characters die, I am bothered by it. And I think, wow, I didn't see that coming.
I just really like that about this movie, and it was a pleasant surprise for me. And I feel if this movie were more well known, it would get a lot more credit for actually trying. Especially when I saw the ape character, I was a little iffy. This movie, unfortunately, is restored, and this is one of the movies that I think wasn't meant to be restored, and the fact that you're seeing a 1080p cut of this movie actually hinders your viewing experience, especially since when this movie came out, it was panned to some degree because the cuts and negatives they had were actually very dark. Some would say so much you couldn't even see what was going on in some of the action sequences. So I feel whoever restored this movie took attention to lighting to make it seem lighter, but that in turn kind of showed the magician's hand a bit in some of the scenes, especially with the hand. It showed the monkey's hand, especially when you see his face. You can almost see the actual actor's eye, and I hated that. But I watched a trailer for it that was from the original press release, and it was darker, and it was grainier, and it was more effective, which almost made me wish I had seen this on a VHS cut.
Yes, I believe both of us saw the restored version, so I don't think we have experience with watching the original. I can definitely see how it might have been a more enjoyable experience, though, simply because some of the less remarkable special effects would have been obfuscated.
Not to be too tangential here, but I feel if we watched this movie in the days of video stores, it would be more effective as well. You would have a darker negative of the film. And with video stores, you get just the clear clamshell case of a movie. And you really don't know what it is. And when you put it in, all you're introduced to is just this train whooshing by and credits rolling, which we gave Carnival of Souls hell, but this movie also just puts you in the middle of the action with this train just going, and you have no idea what's going on. And you're seeing in the credits Spanish, Russian, Chinese. You think, what am I watching? And I feel that the modern age where we can just look stuff up, see who's in a movie, see what else they've been on, kind of detracts from the mystery of this movie in some regard, unfortunately. But that's the world we live in now.
I mean, yeah, that's a philosophical discussion that you can have about a wide variety of topics. I mean, one thing that I was going to say in jest was that I think literally everything was better in the days when we had video stores. But I think that going into detail about that would take much longer than we can spend in a Horror Express review.
Definitely. So, our Dr. Wells character, he becomes concerned about Natasha because she's been in the bathroom for too long. Not being able to find her, he starts looking about all the cars, and it is there that Dr. Wells is grabbed by the hand of the ape. And there's a little bit of a struggle here, and with the way the story went, I thought they were actually going to kill Dr. Wells. I never had that same fear with Christopher Lee's Dr. Saxon character, but I wouldn't have put it past them to kill Dr. Wells at this point, and I wouldn't have thought that had they not already killed Natasha, and they'd already been built up as sort of a dynamic duo. Thankfully, though, the efforts of the ape are thwarted by the Russian, what is he, an inspector?
Are you referring to Mirov, right?
Mirov, yes.
Yes,
Mirov,
he is some form of an investigator.
Yes, I believe he's the head guard or something. He's over all the guards. And this leads to an altercation with Mirov and the ape. So Mirov shot the ape finally in the chest, and we see the ape's going to die. But at the same time, Mirov looks at the ape, and he also collapses and starts to feel woozy. I thought he was going to die, but then he woke up, so I thought it was a close encounter. I thought they played out what was going to happen next really well, up to a point. Would you agree?
Yes. Now, the scene of Mirov shooting the creature, I found to be excellent and surprising. And this was one of the first in a series of choices that this movie made that continuously subverted my expectations in a very positive way. There were many times when I would be watching a scene in this film and I thought I knew what I was getting into, and I was maybe being a little bit superior, thinking like, "Oh, look at that special effect," or "Oh, that's kind of ridiculous." And then something would happen in the film, and I would be like, "Oh no, that's really cool. I really like that." And I'm saying all this to preface the fact that we're maybe halfway through the movie now, and the creature has been killed, and I just found that to be so amazing. Like they got a gun and they shot the creature and it died. How often does that happen in horror movies?
And honestly, the movie could have ended right here because it's not one of those things where you have your fake out, but there's still all this unresolved stuff. In everything that's happened in the story at this point, if they wanted to, they could have spent 5 more minutes and just called it a movie.
Yeah,
and that would have been fine. It wasn't one of those cases where, oh, the creature or whatever can't be dead because we have all these unresolved loose ends hanging.
And to be clear, we're not saying that it would have been a good movie and a good ending if it had ended here.
Correct me if you think something different, but the second half of this movie I almost found more enjoyable.
Oh yeah, for me, if you want to divide this movie into 3 parts, the first part and the third part are both absolutely amazing. It kind of dithers a little bit in the middle. We have a lot of conversational scenes and character building scenes on the train, and I'm not one of those people that turn my brain off the moment characters start talking, but a lot of them didn't seem to go anywhere particularly for me. But both ends of this movie, the beginning and the end, are great.
I would almost describe it as a trip to Disney World. When you come here, you can equate Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing as Cinderella's castle, and you go to Main Street USA and you say, okay, here we are, this is great, this is nice. But then you get to the second half and you get to Frontierland and all that and all the wacky Pixar rides, and you say, okay, so there's more to this than just Cinderella's castle and a bunch of screaming ass kids.
Yes, and it is in the second half that some of the scenes go off the rails. And that's not just a stupid pun. I mean it literally. There's some excellent acting and some really weird situations that we get into.
And I believe it's to the actor's credit. I don't feel like a lot of the situations here and the logic jumps could be handled by a less seasoned group of people. You have to have someone who can make this dialogue work, and you have good hands with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. If they can't make it work, you just have shit dialogue completely. Because some of the leaps in logic here and the things that these people say, if it wasn't handled right, it would just be schlocky and dismissible.
Oh yeah, absolutely agree. And they handle it very well, but there is always that voice in the back of my mind that's imagining Christopher Lee's train of thought going, "Why? What am I doing here?" As he's just stating this pseudo-scientific mumbo jumbo.
So we're kind of introduced to, I would say, the second act of the story. And in order to keep the story flowing and to not have the question of why are we here be presented, we are presented with Mirov waking up. And there's some questionable music cues that let us know that something is off about him. He's exploring himself, so automatically you're assuming, okay, this creature, whatever it is, has somehow influenced him or gone into his body. That's just what I took from it. I believe that's pretty obvious from the music cues.
I disagree. The music cues definitely tell you that something is off, but if you aren't going into this with prior knowledge of body snatcher stories, again, like we mentioned, The Thing, or with the notion that something must be happening to continue the film, I don't think you can immediately make the assumption that the creature is now inside Mirov, because all we know so far is that it's some kind of magical monkey.
Essentially, that's what it is. But there's definitely something off about Mirov. And in order not to spend too much time on him, they cut to our main people doing an autopsy. So we have Wells, Saxton, and Jones, Miss Jones, performing an autopsy on this creature. And it's here that we get this really cool scene, I think, when they're examining the body and they learn that the creature attacks through the eyes. And I believe this was supposed to be some sort of play on the eyes being the window to the soul, if you want to go that far with it. What do you think about this introduction of the character attacking people through the eyes?
As someone who really likes to investigate the minutia of how abilities work in fictional worlds and how they might be scientifically plausible in ours, I found this explanation to be very wanting. Essentially, what's happening is the creature stares at you, and by making eye contact with you, it is able to download the contents of your brain into its brain. And this is all happening somehow through the visual link that is established through eye contact. That seems a little bit questionable to me.
I would argue that, but you could also argue that while Dr. Saxton and Wells are great in their field, they are still a product of their time. And as doctors of their time, 1906, there is still some hokey, nimbly-wimbly, timey-wimey stuff about medical science.
Yeah, and I will definitely give that to this movie's credit. It benefits greatly from the time in which it was filmed and the time in which the story is set. Because if we had a pristine, chrome, 2020, or maybe even like 2060 if it was set in the future, medical facility in which some guy in a white lab coat was trying to tell me this bullshit, I would just tune out of the movie. But the fact that it is set in this realm where we don't really understand all that much about science relative to what we know now, you can imagine that maybe everything they're saying is wrong, and they're just getting the gist of how this might work.
Yes, and during them investigating this autopsy, they let slip that Natasha was an undercover spy. And when she is killed, it's almost brushed off. I think they kind of bury the lead with Natasha being killed because we've established that something is off with Mirov, but they've established that Natasha is an undercover spy, and we don't really know what she was after. We just know it has something to do with the Count and the Countess.
Yes, she is an undercover spy as opposed to the above-the-board, well-known spies that we often get.
Yes, I don't understand why they call them undercover spies. Of course they're undercover, they're spies. No one's going to tell the above-the-board spies. So during this autopsy, they introduce this new element where they extract blood from the eye and they look at it under a microscope. And through looking at it in a microscope, they can see the last thing that the creature was seeing.
Like it's in a viewfinder. Like it's literally a slideshow of the creature's last field of vision.
Very much a viewfinder type thing. The effect doesn't work, but I like the idea behind it.
So, apart from the fact that I want to just wink at this scene and say, yep, that checks out, I really, really, really like this idea. I agree with you.
Well, you still have people at this time period that thought you have ghosts in your blood.
I actually want to talk about this pretty extensively because this was the scene for me when this movie went from being kind of enjoyable, kind of hokey, to really, really good. There is a certain type of fear, it's very specific, that is derived from making a sudden realization about a truth that has been present the entire time. To give a couple of real world examples, there was a time when I was a young child where I was playing out in my grandmother's yard and I was messing around in this little hole, kind of like throwing sticks and rocks and stuff in it. And there was a collection of what I thought were rocks at the bottom where stuff had fallen into the hole. And after maybe 5 to 10 minutes of playing in this area, I realized that it wasn't rocks that were down in that hole, it was the head of a snake. I had been
Nope,
I had been playing around right next to a snake that was staring up at me from its home.
not me, homie.
The phrase, if it were a snake, it would have bit me. Well, that's not true. It was a snake and it didn't bite me. But that sudden pang of fear that you get from realizing how close you've been to danger this entire time is difficult to describe, and it's unlike any other feeling that you will experience with regards to fear. Another example might be you come home and the light in your living room is on, and you unpack and you change clothes, and then you realize, wait a minute, I didn't leave the light on. Who's in my house? The reason that I have gone to such lengths to explain that feeling is because that is the exact feeling that I got and that I think the characters get when they realize the nature of this creature. Up to this point in the movie, we've been assuming it's some type of magical zombie monkey, and that's kind of stupid. But then we make the realization that no, that monkey was just the host of this creature. This creature is something much, much older than the monkey, much, much more mysterious. It probably came from a different planet or a different dimension, and all it is a consciousness that was inhabiting the monkey. When we look at this viewfinder, we see dinosaurs. We see a picture of the planet Earth from space.
Which, not to undermine what's going on, this story takes place in 1906. No one had. Perhaps it's undercut by the fact that this image of the Earth is the famous image of the Earth that everyone's seen from the satellite. That was probably new at the time. But for these characters in 1906, nobody had seen the actual planet. And just thinking about how that would affect me was honestly kind of chilling.
Mm-hmm. And that feeling that you get, you come to the realization of, oh wait, the movie's not over. We killed the monkey, but there's still some ancient alien consciousness on the loose. This is so much bigger than we ever thought it was.
And this is where Saxton has a moment of foreshadowing and clarity where he asks, how would the beast die if he knew so much?
I've got to admit, that statement didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Like, it doesn't matter how much you know, you can still get shot.
I would argue that our character of Saxton, he finds comfort in knowledge. This man has spent his whole life just gathering knowledge, treating facts exactly what they are, and regardless of what happens, he can always lean on the pillar of facts. And as long as you are on that pillar, you will be perfectly safe. But the moment you get off of that pillar is when you will die. The fear of the unknown.
Sorry, you were giving me serious Augur of Dunlane vibes. You seek meaning, shelter in knowledge. You will not find it.
And it's also here that we have more of Pajardov, who, again, the eternal buzzkill, says the unholy one is among us.
No, I'm just laughing at the context of this scene. Go on.
And this is a time where Mirov is in the car with the Count and Countess and Pajardov, and we get this very reminiscent scene of the candle going out and the picture of Jesus falling on its face, almost as if it had jelly on it.
It was painted, a picture of Jesus painted with jelly.
And wherever the devil is, jelly goes face side down.
Joking aside, I thought this was a good scene too. Like, there's something about looking at Prajardov's face as the lights kind of dim, and he has this maniacal grin talking about the devil, and then the picture of Jesus falls off the wall.
Yes, I will say Pajardov commits. This actor committed to this role. And
a lot.
it's 100% effective. And I want to argue this is how Russian monks apparently look at the time. I want to say this look for Russian monks is creepier than nuns. Come at me.
You wanna? No, I'm not. I'm not gonna come at you. I'm gonna inquire as to why you think nuns are creepy.
Well, just in the zeitgeist of horror, it's been established that nuns are creepy, apparently, with films like The Nun and any movie, or even, if you want to go further, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, 4, and 5 have creepy nuns.
I am aware that it has become this repeating theme in the horror genre, but I have to admit, I have never understood it. There's nothing creepy about nuns.
I feel the Rasputin type character would be very effective in horror if it was utilized more.
Absolutely.
It's just a very madman look, but also when you ascribe to that look and person a sense of importance for your moral well-being, it's just a great contrast, and I would love to see that done to its fullest extent.
Well,
I would argue it doesn't here.
It divorces the idea of faith and the existence of a greater power from feelings of comfort and understanding. Lots of people turn to religion so that they can feel safe and comfortable and as though they understand the world. And so when you have the representative of religion being this creepy, homeless-looking man dressed in black robes preaching about evil, it makes you realize how terrifying the concept of a god is in a vacuum, which is a very Lovecraftian theme.
And that kind of happens in our next scene, at least the understanding of that for Pajardov, as him and the Countess walk in on the autopsy of the creature, and they both look into the microscope. Sorry, I wanted to say stethoscope.
I'm looking into this stethoscope, I can't see shit!
But they look into the microscope, and they see the planet Earth, and that sends Pajardov into quoting Genesis, I believe it is, something to do with the world. And so we see Pajardov have this understanding of this greaterness that is in his presence. And this is when we first see a switch in Pajardov's character. No longer is he about following the Lord, following God. He just wants to follow whatever this great power is that he is presumably in the presence of.
This guy does a clean 180. He has been spending the entire movie preaching about people's eternal souls and about the evils of Satan and all of that. And then he meets what he believes to be the devil and is like, hey man, you want to chill? It's really weird.
I guess it's kind of like when you look at the concept of something versus the actuality of something, being faced with a concept versus an actuality. And I feel this man has had a lot of doubt in his life. We have a little vignette later where we find out he had some attraction to the Countess, which I believe is where he had these sowed seeds of doubt in what he was doing. But seeing this creature affirm to him that whatever this was what he needed to follow, because he has some sort of attraction to power. And that's what drew him to the Count and the Countess, I believe. Perhaps I'm reading into it, but that's just my take.
Oh, I mean, that makes sense. The way that people think about something in the abstract is usually very different from how they behave when they encounter it in person. I mean, there's lots of examples of this. I don't think I really need to get into them. They did make a song about this, though. He could preach the Bible like a preacher, full of ecstasy and fire, but when faced with demons from the darkness, he would prove himself a liar. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
Was that in The Sound of Music?
Yes, it was. Good job.
Okay, good. That was the one that the little Nazi boy sang to the 16-year-old, right?
Yes.
Ah, okay, good. See, I know my music, people. But from this scene, it's cut when all the lights go out in the train because they go through a tunnel. Which was interesting to me because I never put together that the lights would go off during the day. So going under a tunnel would be a problem because it would suddenly be pitch black. I just figured the lights would be on. But when the lights do come back on, the eye and Pajardov is gone. He has stolen the eye and is somewhere on the train, claiming it to be the eye of Satan.
Which, the entire train going dark is an important plot point moving forward, and it often I have to admit, it begs the question: why didn't they just cut the power on the train? But maybe we'll get to that bridge later. In some of the scenes, like when we have Saxton speaking to Mirov, who has been infected by the creature, Mirov could have just like punched the light in the room and then grabbed Saxton and been like, "Look at me." I don't. There are a lot of situations where I feel like the creature could have used its powers and its advantage to a little bit more of an effect.
From here in the story, our characters split up and we follow Miss Jones, which I didn't really understand the process of doing this. It's a train. There's two ways to go. There's only two ways he could have gone. You could literally have half the people go one way, half go to a other, and you will find him somewhere in there. There's no need to split up. He didn't go out the side. So they have Miss Jones go out by herself, and to this disservice, she is unfortunately killed by Mirov, who is now the creature. This is our first confirmation of that. But before Miss Jones is killed by Mirov, he is playing cat and mouse with her and asking her questions about who all knows about these pictures and the blood that she brings up. And she just starts name dropping people. Oh, just Saxton, Wells, the Countess, Pajardov, they all know about it. You can see him making a Kill Bill list in his head of people he needs to take care of, and then he kills her. And for me, this was the death that was most sad. I just really latched on to Miss Jones as a character, and I really liked her and hated to see her die. So at this point, the whole train is in an uproar, wanting to know what's going on. They found out more about the dead bodies, and they have all these questions, and Saxton and Wells have kind of made a bit of a commotion out of finding Pajardov with this eye. And I believe Pajardov has too, because he's just walking around all crazy with an eye in his hand. And it's then that the monster, pretending to be the inspector, tries to calm everybody down and take control of the situation, but ultimately says he will shoot anyone who tries to get off the train, causing more commotion. So now this whole train is a hostage situation.
Feels a little bit like the inspector tipping his hand here. If I were one of the individuals who suspected that the creature was inhabiting the consciousness of a human on the train, and then I have the guy who collapsed after encountering the creature locking down the train and threatening to shoot people if they leave, I know who my prime suspect is. And that's not just because I watched the movie and I know that it's him. That was really suspicious.
But from here, I would argue the story for this next 15-20 minutes is more Mirov moving about the train as the wolf in sheep's clothing, asking people questions, gaining understanding of just what everybody knows. And through this, he's talking to Saxton, who has put himself in the middle of this with Wells, and he informs the inspector, not knowing it's the creature, that he's ordered the train to stop at the next outpost, which cuts directly to the inspector killing the conductor, which is weird to me, because how is this thing gonna move? Who's stopping and starting this train at this point?
I'm really not sure. It makes sense conceptually.
Because the train does stop at the next outpost.
Yeah. It makes sense conceptually that the creature would want to kill the conductor to gain the knowledge to navigate the train itself. But that does beg the very excellent question of who is driving this thing.
Mm-hmm. And it's right after the kill of the conductor that Pajardov walks into the conducting station and sees Mirov and offers to serve him, which is now interesting, because in other stories like this, you don't have the juxtaposition of this creature now has an ally, which I think is cool and almost presents a Dracula-esque-ness to this character, and that he has a little side person to do side quests. But to this character's credit, he says, no, I don't really need you. I'm millions of years old. You're very inconsequential to me. And poor Pajardov, he's just always trailing behind this guy, just trying to be included.
Definitely gives you sad puppy vibes. I really like the dynamic there, though, because a lot of villain and henchman relationships tend to be blatantly abusive, in that the henchman is kind of pathetic and sad and is always groveling about, and the villain is using them for their own means. In this case, we have the villain not giving a shit about the henchman one way or the other. He basically just ignores him. But the henchman is not pathetic. He's simply in awe of the ancient power that is presented itself before him, and is so impressed by it that he wants to help it.
Yes, but until about the end of the movie, Pejoranov's just, like you said, running around like a sick puppy, and Mirov, the creature, is just trying to get him off his back. Doesn't give him a single task to do. Pejoranov's just inserting himself into the situations with the guy. Mirov will do or say something that's menacing or maniacal, and Pejoranov will just be like, yeah, and I'm with him. And Mirov's just like, no, you're not, though. You're not with us. So, unbeknownst to our main cast of characters, they decide that since everything comes from the eye, they will inspect everybody's eyes. And this is the scene, I would say, if you gotta go use the bathroom, go now. Because this scene ultimately leads to nothing. It's just a bunch of shots of people taking a literal magnifying glass to people's eyes to try to see something. And the engineer says they should use x-rays, which also leads to nothing. Because that's a statement a scientist would make, and the engineer clearly is an engineer and not a scientist. In fact, if this movie were made today, I would expect Saxon to say something, well, it's a good fucking idea you're not a scientist, huh?
He introduces himself as a man of science, Dylan.
But when asked if he's a scientist, I'm an engineer. Or, are you a doctor? I'm an engineer. That piece of paper that he got at college was the best thing that ever happened to him, because I don't even know his name. I tried looking it up and I couldn't find it. He's just the engineer.
You know, I don't remember his name either. No, I don't
I tried
consider that to
looking
be
it up.
particularly surprising.
It's not important to the story or anything, but I couldn't find him in the credits. Couldn't find him on IMDb. Couldn't find him on Wikipedia. He's just the engineer. Not even the engineer of the train, which would make sense and add another layer. And for the first time in this movie, we are taken outside of the train to this outpost. And I don't have many notes on it because I was confused. I was honestly saying, what the fuck are these people? Who the fuck are these people? And when, what's his name? Telly Savalas? What's his name?
Telly Savalas, I believe.
When Telly Savalas came onto the scene, this movie, in one sense, went off the rails a bit, because Telly Savalas is in his own film. You have this group of guys reading out this warning notice saying that they're gonna stop, and they're clearly some sort of police or army. I didn't understand what was going on there. And Telly Savalas is introduced in very Telly Savalas fashion. He is in some sort of like an animal stall, and he rolls over from a fur coat and he has a lady in bed with him, and he just starts smoking and spouting, I guess, what's supposed to be forlorn Russianisms, because I didn't understand anything going on in this scene. I just understood the vibe of, yeah, this guy is something.
So he is a Cossack captain. And
Captain.
If I understand correctly, he thinks that there is some type of criminal activity going on the train, like maybe they're insurgents or something of that nature.
Okay.
So he feels the need to investigate. But the real kicker is when he boards the train with his guards. This scene is so fantastic for such a ridiculous reason, because you have this captain of the guard. He is in a completely different movie. He doesn't even give the slightest impression that he's actually Russian. He's just walking around in this big red and gold coat, pushing everybody else around, making this his own movie for like 5 minutes straight. It is amazing.
I will 100% agree. I don't want to say he stole the show because we have so much talent in this movie, but his performance was particularly memorable. Not really knowing a whole lot about Telly Savalas, I feel that his imprint on the film was clearly visible when he was on screen versus Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, who are pretty similar to any other Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing movie they are in. Not to downplay anything they did because they're incredible, but Telly Savalas definitely just put himself into this.
No, I'll go ahead and say he stole the show, at least for the scenes that he was in. Every time this guy is on screen, he is the most intimidating and focal presence in the room. He walks around like he can kill anybody at any time and it doesn't matter. He's smoking these big cigars in this train. Prajardov tries to convince him to leave Mirov alone, and he just starts whipping him, like with an actual whip.
An actual whip. Where did he get this whip? No one knows.
Yes, and one of the characters, and please let me know who it is, because I have forgotten. I think it's either Saxton or Mirov. Telly Savalas' character, I believe it's Captain Kazan is his name. He grabs the arm of one of his guards and uses that arm to punch the guy in the groin.
Yes, that was Wells.
Wells, okay, yeah, the only one I didn't mention. But still, that was just so glorious. Like, you didn't even bother to attack him yourself. You grabbed the limb of one of your guards and attacked him with that.
He not only hijacked the train, he hijacks the movie for a solid 10 minutes.
Because he uses the subtle crazy. You know, when you want to be crazy, you don't go full Joker jumping around. You just give that impression that nobody knows what you're going to do at any given moment. Every time I looked at him, I was like, I don't know exactly what you're going to do, but I am very eager to find out.
To put it in context how out of place this character is, imagine Silence of the Lambs, and then imagine in the background of the tense moment between Hannibal and Jodie Foster's character, you have Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow just in the background making noises and whooshing around.
Yeah, or
with a jar
actually,
of dirt.
I think a better allegory would be if Hannibal and the main character were having their discussion, and then Jack Sparrow just waltzes in blatantly drunk and starts rambling about something, and then the two of them are forced to interact with him.
And that's what happened to this movie.
Yeah.
But one thing that happened beforehand that I think we need to discuss is an interaction with Mirov the creature and the engineer. During this interaction, it's been established that what Natasha was trying to steal was steel. And the Count and Countess have been really showing off this steel, talking about how when it gets hot, it just gets stronger, and it can't even be scratched by a diamond. And Mirov, metaphorically and physically, picks the engineer's brain about this and says, could it be used for space travel? And how close is science to defying gravity or stopping gravity? And the engineer starts talking about Kurkovsky and his theory on rockets and space travel and how close they are to that. And it's at this point that, of course, the engineer has valuable knowledge that this creature needs, so he absorbs that information and kills the engineer. Pretty much, if you don't want to die in this movie, don't talk to people. Don't provide valuable insight. If you're an engineer and you know there's some sort of monster running around that likes to suck out information, just say, I don't know.
And don't look people in the eye.
I don't know. Google it.
I don't think they had Google in 1906.
I would love to see this movie made now, but with social media. It would probably just be like The Children. They didn't really have anything of value to suck out, so he just left them alone.
You know, that's actually probably a good and poignant point. If this movie were set nowadays, the creature wouldn't even bother sucking anyone's brain out, because everybody's too stupid. He would just get on Google and be like, oh, I understand.
But could he suck out the information from Google? Him and an Amazon Alexa. He just looks at the Alexa and absorbs all the information. I can get Prime for $99 a year. But anyway, we're back to the scene where Telly Savalas is having his one-man production and has hijacked the train. And Mirov is there and he's seeing everything. He's kind of quiet in the background for the most of it until stuff just starts going crazy. And Mirov and Telly Savalas kind of have a standoff after the monk gets whipped, which we don't know why that's a part of their process. Why do they have a whip? I feel a billy club is important and a gun is important, but an actual whip? Why?
I feel like that would probably be common procedure. You have to have some form of non-lethal enforcement tool that will cause people to fear you. I didn't find that to be strange at all. I found it to be badass, but not strange. I mean, who am I to judge the procedures of Cossack officers like 120 years ago or something like that?
This has nothing to do with my job. This is my kink. So it's at this point that during this standoff between Mirov and Telly Savalas that Saxton has the idea to dim the lights to expose Mirov as the creature. As he does, the lights are dimmed, and we see Mirov's eyes are glowing red. And we see this glowing red eye effect in people only twice for what's going to happen. Could we talk a little bit about that eye effect?
Of course, and I know we touched on it toward the beginning of the episode, but what else did you want to mention?
Mostly getting into the quality of the version we watched, the negative, it kind of does a bit of a disservice because you can see they just had two red lights that they patched over the eyes. That's how they did it. It wasn't any kind of special effect. In some ways, that made it more effective. In some ways, it made it less effective. Personally, I think it also correlates to what we were talking about earlier, where it loops back around. It's bad, and then it loops back around to being good because it falls into that uncanny valley.
Yes, absolutely. And my opinion of the eye effects is the same as when I first mentioned it. It's so obviously bad, but it doesn't matter because it just gives you that eerie uncanniness that makes you think, ooh, I don't want to look at that. I don't know exactly what that is, but I don't like it.
So from this altercation with Mirov and Telly Savalas, again, I don't even know his name. I'm just going to call him Telly Savalas.
Captain Kazan.
I prefer Telly Savalas.
Okay.
Because that's exactly who he's playing. Whatever was on paper isn't the character we got. We got Telly Savalas. No, he actually, I did read, he improv most of his lines. He was the character that did improv 90% of his lines, and it shows.
And it was excellent.
It was
I'm
excellent.
So glad he did it.
I would say the 10% that wasn't improv was whenever they were in the guard shack or wherever that is, and he's doing that Russian speech calling people little father and things of that nature. But in this altercation, one of the guards has a clean shot at Mirov, and he takes it and shoots Mirov in the back. And as Mirov's dying, he runs off, and Pajardov, being the little sick puppy, runs after him, requesting that he go into him. Again, it's just weird.
Then the romantic music starts playing, and we cut away at the last minute.
And you can see Mirov doesn't do it instantly, like he wants to use this person. He honestly thinks to himself, do I really want to? It's a case of this is the worst person that could possibly be at my side right now. Do I really want to use this person as a vessel? But he's dying, and ultimately he relents. And we get the third act of this movie where Pajardov is the monster, and it's honestly terrifying seeing him with the red eyes and how his demeanor has now changed, and he uses Pajardov's memories to fuck with people, such as whenever he confronts the Count and Countess, he talks about how much Pajardov loved the Countess and how that made him question his faith. And that leads to an interaction with him and the Count where he looks into it, dims the lights, and looks in his eyes and kills him. At this point, the story kind of got a little bit muddled for me, but then the movie's just gone completely tits up. You have the guards opening fire at the entrance where they came from. The rest of the people feel like they're being held hostage and are trying to run and hide somewhere. And Pajardov just walks in and starts killing all the guards just by looking at them. And we get just this mass boom, 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 boom of people's eyes turning white and just blood coming out of the eyes. It's almost a pretty chilling montage when you see all of it.
It is very chilling. I certainly question the efficacy of these soldiers if they're not able to kill this single man as he is violently staring into the eyes of them one at a time. I really feel like that wasn't an effective battle strategy. But the scene itself is very terrifying. And directly afterwards, we are introduced to a new power that this creature has that we did not see coming.
One thing to touch on that very quickly before we move on to that, though, is this standoff between Saxton and the monk. In stories similar to this, by this point we're so caught up with this creature type taking down everybody that we don't get any look inside this creature's head. And it's really interesting in the scene. It's almost like Pajardov is trying to coax Saxton into being on his side, talking about how he has all this information he can give him. He can end wars. He can end hunger. He can do all this thing. He's almost as old as time, and he can do all this stuff for him. And in movies like this, you rarely see that. where the creature is trying to sway the scientific mind. But Saxton, being the way he is, knowing what he knows, he dismisses it and the fight pretty much continues, which is where he says, but first, hold my beer. And we're introduced to the new power you mentioned.
I'm going to touch on the scene that you just discussed because that was one of my favorite parts of the movie. I talked about how one of my first favorite parts was the realization of how ancient this creature is. And then here we have the payoff for that. Because as you said, in this great confrontation, Saxton is threatening the infected Prajardov. And the idea of this creature being so ancient and so knowledgeable that it could have all the solutions to humanity's problems, that it could be a wealth of information about the entire history of the Earth, even knowing that the creature is, from our perspective, evil and very malicious, that creates the ethical dilemma of, yeah, should we kill this thing? Can we justify killing this thing? It has so much knowledge. And to present that argument, especially to a character who is steeped in science, is very, very effective and very compelling. And I love that the movie went in that direction.
And I honestly thought they don't play it as this is an impossible circumstance where the good guy is going to come on top. It played off almost as though this entity was going to live, and they were going to somehow use his information to better the world. They don't lean on one side or the other with that until, of course, the next scene.
And there are a lot of versions of this scene in different media where you will have some type of powerful character who is, say, a genie or the devil or a dark wizard or something along those lines. And when they're finally cornered, they start to bargain with the hero and say, I can give you wealth, money, power, gold, your own galaxy, in the case of Bill Cipher. And it's always very clearly bullshit, right? Mm-hmm. They are just trying to save their own skin. And that is what's happening here. He is cornered and he's trying to save his own skin. But the difference is that he might also be telling the truth. Like, that he really does have all this information. And he's not, as far, again, if you disagree, let me know. He's not inherently malicious or anything of that nature. It's just that he's a different species with his own agenda trying to get things done.
You could say the same, though, for any movie about this sort, though. They're not inherently evil, it's just trying to survive. But I don't get the feeling, like you said, like this thing is trying to bargain for its life. If anything, I feel like Pajardov is just fucking with Saxton at this point. Just telling him these things that are true and that he can come in. And if it works, it works. But if it doesn't, it doesn't. But he knows Saxton will have to live forever with this what if of potential life-changing knowledge that he's always wanted.
The temptation is very great.
Especially for this character who knowledge is his pillar.
And the answer is not clear-cut. I mean, the entire purpose of this movie, the reason that this movie exists, is because he was trying to find the next step in the theory of evolution. So this is in many ways representing the fulfillment of Saxton's entire purpose.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So shortly after this bargaining scene fails, we are introduced to the final power that this creature apparently possesses, which raises many questions in my mind about why we didn't see it used earlier, I have to admit. But he is capable of raising the dead, at least the dead that the creature itself has killed. And so all of the guards that were killed in the previous scene, including Captain Kazan and several others, are risen from the dead as these white-eyed fried egg zombies. And they begin stalking through the darkened train, representing a major threat to all of our surviving characters.
And at this point, I thought the scene was really effective. Feel like it could have came off as really hokey. They described them as zombies, but I wouldn't necessarily say they were zombies as much as they were mind-controlled pawns. But I loved it just the same.
I mean, it was reanimated corpses. They were zombies, but yeah, it wasn't as though they were themselves mindless entities. They were clearly creatures who were in some sense connected with a hive mind. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I thought the visual of all the guards, especially, was very effective. With the white-out eyes, the blood dripping, I thought that was very effective. I thought that posed a very great threat, because at the end, whatever this creature is, right now he's Pajardov. He's this sickly-looking little monk person that could easily be overcome as long as you don't look him in the eye.
We'll tell that to all the soldiers.
Apparently soldiers have really good eye contact.
That's a strange compliment.
Well, they say they say don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes.
Well, they're already dead at that point.
Well, yeah. So now we have this going on. Somehow Wells is able to send out a notice to the next train depot where the train intersects to move the line. I don't know how Well knew that the next line didn't go anywhere, but he did. Again, leap in logic. And you see that he is in the back car with Saxton, with all the people just hiding from what they assume is the guards, because the final showdown with the guards and the creature happened after they had already left. So they feel like they're being attacked by the guards, but also this entity. So they're working to try to get this train undone somehow, which I'm not really sure of the phonetics of it. What did you think of this? The logic?
I am mostly curious about how all of this looks from the perspective of the employee, I'm not sure entirely what to call him, that was receiving this message. I would very much like to know what kind of training he had. Imagine that you are sitting there at a switch for these train tracks, and for some reason you just happen to have a switch that leads to rails that go off of a cliff into certain death. And you receive a message that says, hey, we've got a train coming your way filled with passengers, mostly civilians. I'm just going to need you to press that button that's going to kill them all real quick. And this guy shrugs his shoulders and says,
Maybe it's war.
maybe it's war. And then he just does it.
I mean, as long as he has documented paperwork, I don't see what the issue is.
Where did they get this guy? This is a smaller scale equivalent of nuclear launch codes in terms of ethical dilemmas. And this guy is just like, fuck it, I'm gonna kill all these people. Don't need an explanation.
He has a very chaotic understanding of the trolley issue.
Yeah, he had that explained to him incorrectly, I think.
You either hurt no one or you kill everyone.
It
But
rem-
not the back car if it's disconnected.
It reminds me of this recording that I heard, and I don't remember where I heard it, but it was of this guy explaining the trolley problem to his young daughter. She was probably kindergarten age or younger. And her answer was that you should leave the trolley where it is so that you hit more people. I may be getting the details of that story slightly wrong, but that's what it reminded me of.
This guy does pull the lever to move the track, and this scene was actually pretty suspenseful for me. Like, my hands were a little sweaty, and my butthole was a little puckered. Just at how well they play this, do they have enough time to save themselves? At the speed of the train, I didn't think they would. So I was honestly wondering how that was going to play out. And of course, they fix the car in the ta-da nick of time, but it is literally the ta-da nick of time. That car, you just see it slowly go, and I think it's more effective that in most times we see a shot like this, you're closed in on the car and how close it is to the rail. I feel like it's more effective from the viewpoint we had of at the bottom of the cliff looking up. Because you have this doubt of, okay, how close is it? How fast is it still moving? And of course, we see the rest of the train go off the cliff and crash and burn with the reanimated corpses of the soldiers and Pajardov monster who was at the conductor stand screaming.
I have a confession that I have to make.
What?
I had some important meetings and emails that I was having to schedule and send out that came up impromptu while this film was approaching its climax. So I must have missed just a couple seconds worth of screen time. But when I was first watching this movie, I did not see them unlatch the car and escape. So so I saw the train plummet to the ground and blow up, and I thought the movie killed everybody.
Oh,
And,
so you
and
didn't know.
yeah, I was like, wow, this movie had balls. Oh my gosh, they're all dead, and that's the ending.
No, they, for the most part, are all safe in the last car.
And I found that out this morning because after I watch the movies, I like to do a little bit of research to kind of see the context of the film and some trivia. And I was reading the synopsis, and at the end it talks about them all surviving, and I thought, I saw a different cut. What? What had they lived?
But at the same time, here we are with these characters. They've survived, but now they're in the middle of the Russian wilderness in winter.
Which, again, I'm not entirely sure about how all of the mechanics of the train operation works, but I feel like they shouldn't be too far away from the station with the guy that tried to kill them all, right?
See, that's the tricky one. It's the Trans-Siberian Express. Is there gonna be another Trans-Siberian Express?
I don't
feel
know.
like trains can't travel too close together.
I find it inappropriate to speculate on things I don't understand.
Well, I'm just trying to think logistically. To reduce the amount of crashes or anything, you would have to at least spread them out by a day or two, at the very least.
So are you insinuating that this is transitioning to a Donner Party-esque scenario?
Well, no, I'm just saying it's an out of the frying pan into the fire situation. They survived this monster, but now you have these people who seem to be not on the upper crust of society, but definitely in an elevated.
They are an upper class.
Yes, they're an upper class. I wasn't going to say an upper class. They're definitely not the Count and Countess, but they are still in the upper echelons. Do they have the equipment to survive such conditions?
Well, they got a pretty big fire going if they can get down there.
I'm sure Saxton still has his outfit from when he was in Szechuan.
I would say it's more so they jumped out of the fire and into the frying pan. I think ultimately, if you want to take your chances with finding shelter in a frozen wasteland, the possibility of death being that you freeze is probably better than having your brains and memories sucked out of your eyeballs. I don't know for sure, but I think that I would bank on that.
Well, I absolutely see your point. So, with that, that's pretty much the movie where we stand. What were your thoughts of it?
This movie was an absolute delight to me. I think that I'm not really going to say anything here that I haven't said before, but the cast is wonderful. It is loaded. Just about anything that Christopher Lee is in, I love. And we also have Peter Cushing and Telly Savalas and just a host of other really memorable characters. The story is good. I thought it was going to be a stupid ancient zombie monkey and that I was going to hate it. And then all of a sudden I think for me it was when he talked about how he survived in protozoa and fish for eons. Like that is such a primal concept that I just love.
Exactly. We get like a psychology of this thing that in other stories like this we really don't get because they're trying so hard to blend in. But I love that concept for this movie, and I really hate that this movie isn't more well regarded.
Yeah. And just the idea of this ancient entity hiding out for so long and all of these different creatures jumping around species for generations and generations. That the moment that I heard that quote, along with the viewfinder scene, I just realized, wow, that this was kind of ahead of its time in some ways.
So here's my big question. If freezing cold conditions couldn't kill this thing, is a fire going to?
Yes. Now, I'm not gonna pretend that the science here checks out, but things being frozen in ice for a very long time is just, A, on some level, realistic, and B, a trope throughout the entirety of fiction. I mean, we're probably if we do bring up the thing, which I suspect we're going to, that's the premise at the beginning of that movie. It's a premise in At the Mountains of Madness. It's the premise of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I mean, freezing is not treated the same way as other forms of potentially lethal scenarios.
But as you mentioned, right now is probably a good time to get into the similarities between The Thing. They both derive inspiration from the novella Who Goes There that was written in the 50s, correct?
Yes, I believe so. And there was also a movie in the 50s as
Yes.
well.
There was a movie in the 50s called The Thing from Another World. And basically, the plot of that follows a similar one to A Thing from Another World and The Thing, wherein you have a group of scientists in the Arctic tundra, and they come into contact with this alien creature that assimilates to blend in. Now, this movie clearly draws a lot of inspiration from those things. Regarding the similarities and how they work, let's just compare it just between two works. It and The Thing. What were parts about the movie The Thing that worked for you versus parts that worked better in here and vice versa?
Well, I think the starkest difference between the two is definitely the body horror that is prevalent in John Carpenter's The Thing. You could argue that the smooth brain and the weird fried egg eyes represent body horror, and I would be on board for that, but it's nowhere near to the extent of the strange, veinous meat monstrosities that we get in The Thing. So I would consider that to be the biggest difference, as well as the degree to which we follow the agency of the creature. In Horror Express, which I like the way they do it much better, you can follow what the thing is doing and who it's inhabiting and what decisions it's making. And it clearly has a human level of intellect that it employs. Whereas in the movie The Thing, it's incredibly ambiguous. You have no idea who's infected at any given moment. At some points, it's heavily implied that the thing has a human level of intelligence. At other points, it behaves like an animal. It's kind of all over the place. I really like John Carpenter's The Thing. I like it a lot.
Right.
But I think Horror Express just does it better.
I would agree. The parts that work in The Thing for me also somehow work in Horror Express. I like in The Thing not knowing much about this creature other than that it's old and it's assimilating. But I also really enjoy getting just a glimpse into the vastness of this creature's understanding. Whereas in The Thing, it's more primal and operates like an animal does, living in the now to survive. This thing has not only survived, but it's adapted.
Yes, and let me be clear. I think that overall, The Thing is probably a better movie. It's
Yes.
just that Horror Express executes much better on the concept of this primordial being. Because, as you said, it explores the idea of what it would be like for this creature to have existed for so many years, for millions of years, although it was frozen for that period of time. So we don't know how long it's existed consciously. But the fact remains, it's a relic of the history of the Earth that long predates humanity. And they actually explore that rather than just putting teeth in someone's stomach.
And this is in no way a dog of The Thing. I believe it's an excellent movie and it excels in many facets, but there are also ways that this movie, being so similar, also excels in many facets and often for different reasons. And I know me and you've had a discussion about The Thing before.
Yes, maybe you don't want people to know this. If you don't, then just cut this part out. But we did a demo of this podcast to kind of get our bearings together, and we did a review of John Carpenter's The Thing. So we have had a lengthy discussion.
We had a really lively debate about it, and we both really enjoyed the movie. But this movie, to me, you can say the special effects aren't as great. I won't argue with you there. You can tell me the acting isn't as good, which half and half. This is character acting. That movie was going for a more serious film tone with its acting. But it's not so much night and day with these movies as it is afternoon and evening. There are points that work for both, even though they're so similar, but there is a difference.
Yeah, but honestly, though, I wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of the statements that you made leading up to that. I don't think the disparity in special effects is that great. If we're going to be completely honest, the body horror in The Thing, it doesn't look that great. It looks kind of dumb and fake.
Oh, you're gonna
And,
piss people off with that one.
I know, but it's true. And again, I didn't say that it wasn't effective, did I? I didn't say that it wasn't horrifying, but you would be lying to yourself if you thought that it looked real. That or you have pretty low standards for what you consider to look real. And I think the same is true of the acting. You mentioned that maybe the acting in the Horror Express is not so good. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I disagree with that as well. I think the acting is maybe not the most realistic, but but it's still great.
Again, yes, it was a more elevated character acting.
Yeah.
So, and it's a little bit different than if, in the 80s we were trying to make... I feel like in the 80s that was when we first started having acting, that being in a movie, being an actor, was a separate language from stage acting. It wasn't copy-paste. By this point, the language of stage acting and film acting had been clearly defined, and that line was drawn in the sand. And that's where you can see where these two movies are different in terms of acting. Again, I said it in Carnival of Souls, I'll say it here, this could easily be a stage show.
Yeah, it could. I mean, everything literally takes place in the same room. Now, not necessarily canonically, there are a few more rooms on this train.
You would have to change very little to make this a stage show.
Yeah.
Whereas if you were going to make The Thing a stage show, you would have to do rewrites on the dialogue, you'd have to do rewrites on the special effects, you basically have to put the script through a shredder and then rebuild it.
I'm not sure how you do the special effects, but I kind of think you could handle the setting fairly well. I mean, it's mostly confined location in this Antarctic base. Sometimes you go outside, which you could just handle with some dim lighting or some closed curtains or what have you. And then what else would you have in terms of setting? The kennels?
That could honestly be a side stage.
Yeah, I think you could do it.
Yeah, but like I said, this movie, Horror Express, it lends itself more to that style, let's say, because those lines hadn't been clearly defined yet. I love the acting in both, it's just a different style of acting. And for some people, it doesn't work because it's a little too theatrical, a little too unnatural. Whereas The Thing, we developed this natural form of acting, where acting was trying to look as much as you're not performing, where seeing anybody in this movie, you can tell that you're performing a role.
But it's just a different style. It doesn't mean that either one is bad.
Yes. Again, I love both. I love the story in both. Obviously, they're so similar. They just do certain things differently, and I'm on board for both. If I had to pick one that I liked more, I would say I found Horror Express a lot more entertaining. And you still end up with pretty much the same ending. The creature is on fire and destroyed, but you have these people in this cold, unforgiving landscape. How are they going to survive? I would argue that The Thing, well, you don't even have to argue. The Thing is worse because they're in Antarctica. No one's just going to drive a horse and buggy by there. They're on a train track. At some point, someone's going to come by. It's just a matter of, are they going to come by in the nick of time?
Yes. Initially, I was going to disagree with that because to me it felt like the ending of Horror Express was a lot more hopeful. It kind of felt like, yeah, they all survived. The creature died. It's then when you transition into, but how are we going to get out of this, that argument would fall apart. The Thing is still definitely more explicit in that these characters are doomed, like you said. With Horror Express, it's more of a triumphant, we did it, followed by a, oh, what now? With The Thing, you know they're doomed.
So now's the part of the show where we decide if a movie is deep, meaning we find some sort of value in it and we think you should check it out if you haven't already, or if it needs to be cut, meaning you should probably find something else to do with your time. Personally, I think this movie is deep for all intents and purposes. It executes fear very well. I really like the haunting, whistling medley of this. Music's a big deal to me. The creature, I love having that insight into its mind. The character acting in this is wonderful. I really felt it when people died, and I felt bad even for our less developed characters, such as the porter and the countess. And seeing them die, not so gruesomely, but terrifyingly, was very effective for me. What about you, Jacob?
I mean, I'm going to echo all of that. This movie is definitely deep, and not just in the sense of the deep or cut. This movie is legitimately deep because of the realms of philosophy and ethics and science that the nature of this creature forces you to delve into. And I'm not going to pretend that it goes into it in some form of extraordinarily academic sense. But it just makes you think about these things, and that's more than, quite frankly, a lot of horror movies do. The horror genre is not typically something that you go into because you want to think deeply about things. So I am absolutely going to give a thumbs up on this. It was wonderful.
And again, I can't understate with this movie. This was such a pleasant find. I hate that this movie isn't more well known. I really hate it. It's really more of a shame, considering the other projects that our two leads are involved with. Of course, off top of your head, you're going to think Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. And at another level of that iceberg, you're going to think Hammer Horror and the movies of that type. But here we are with this movie. Outside of all that, it's still a damn good movie to watch. And I just love it. It has a special place in my heart.
It's a really low bar that you have to cross in order for me to dislike a movie.
I'm so excited about, and we have a very
special
Yes, because again, we've established he's awesome. But I think that about wraps it up, don't you think, Jacob? I know we say on the show a lot, if you haven't seen it, go watch it, but I cannot stress the importance enough with this movie. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's going to be a blast. And if you have seen it, I mean, we probably won't have much more new to add, but it'll be fun just to reminisce on what a crazy movie that this is, and we're excited to show it to you. And make sure that you like, subscribe, follow, and give us 5 stars on whichever podcast platform you listen to us on. And also give us a comment. Tell us what movie you'd like to see us take a look at. Also, if you haven't already, go follow us on Twitter at DeepHorrorPod. Again, that's at DeepHorrorPod on Twitter. Or you can email us at deepcutsofhorror@gmail.com. Again, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay spooky.